Hey everyone. So this is an excerpt from a video I'm doing on the historiography of the USSR. I wanted to release another excerpt video because again I thought this was a good video to stand on its own that is worth seeing, and also because the main video is a pretty large and sprawling project at this point. So in case I, lose steam and don't ever fully release the full video, I at least have this part which I can release. Also, make sure to subscribe and hit that motherfucking bell to be notified when the full video comes out, because it is pretty much the best thing I've ever made. I've done endless hours of research to show just how deeply anti-USSR propaganda is connected with capitalism and think tanks and so on, so make sure to stay tuned. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into it. One of the core myths about Soviet historiography is the claim that there are no real historians or historical works that speak in favor of the Soviet Union. This is something often said by people who call themselves leftists, that historians are pretty much in unanimous agreement that the USSR was terrible or mostly terrible, and as such, there's really no point in even trying to challenge the common narratives. This is, of course, to give credence to the idea that the anti-USSR guys must be right. And of course, even if you show any works that are in favor of the Soviet Union, these works are instantly dismissed as just being written by crazy cranks or whatever. That was the impetus really to make this whole video I've been working on about USSR studies and the complete corruption of the field, with both liberals and conservatives who have a bone to pick with socialism and who very directly profit extensively from picking that bone as much as possible. But for this excerpt, I wanted to directly address the claim specifically that there is a historical consensus around the USSR being either not socialist or not for the workers or having done some atrocity. And my focus specifically was, of course, on the pre-Khrushchev era of the USSR, because that is the most controversial time. And I'll admit, when I first started to look into this claim myself, back when I wasn't even that big of a fan, or at least I didn't know much about the USSR, I thought I would have a hard time finding much of any positive accounts or academic works about the USSR besides, just a few crackpot weirdos. But the more I looked, the more I found a wealth of what are today almost completely forgotten pamphlets, essays, and books, many of them from widely respected and influential academics. This isn't to say that there aren't, of course, plenty of very, or at least somewhat, anti-USSR scholars. They do make up the majority, but that's not the same as there being a historical consensus, or there not being anything on the other side worth looking into. Now, one of the most well-known pro-USSR historians of the modern day is, of course, Grover Furr. Despite the fact that I think he has done some seemingly very good in-depth historical work, specifically in his work Blood Lies, he has of course also been rightly criticized for saying things like Stalin never committed a crime in the legal sense, or arguing that the deportations were justified. Neither claim of which do I agree with, and I think these claims should rightly be condemned. Furr has often been lambasted as an example of the lack of credibility among pro-Soviet academics. And so, okay, fine. Though I think he's done good work, let's completely write Furr off as someone that has never written anything useful on the basis that he doesn't have a PhD in Russian history and that he said some off things. And the fact that he's a Marxist-Leninist. Let's ignore all of his work, no matter how valuable or not it might be. Well, the problem is you're going to have to write off a lot more people as well to keep making the argument that everyone in favor of the USSR are just crazy quacks, as there are actually quite a few people beyond Grover Furr who take overall at least positive views of pre-Khrushchev USSR, or at least certain specific aspects of the pre-Khrushchev USSR. Okay, now let's look at other academics first, and keep in mind that I will limit myself here to actual books and not pamphlets or academic essays. With one exception, that is, which is the essay Reconsidering the Role of the Soviet Worker by Robert Thurston, who has a PhD in Russian history from the University of Michigan. I highly recommend that everyone read this work. In terms of actual books, there is history professor Michael Carley, whose entire life basically has been devoted to studying Soviet diplomacy, and his incredible work on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 1939, The Alliance That Never Was, and the Coming of World War II. There is Stephen Brains with a PhD in Russian history and his work on Soviet environmentalism, Songs of the Forest. There is Frederick Schumann with a PhD in history and his work on Soviet diplomacy, Russia since 1917. There is Terry Martin, a professor of Russian studies in the history department at Harvard University, and his work on Soviet ethnic policies, Affirmative Action Empire. There is the famous historian and political theorist E.H. Carr's older work, A History of Soviet Russia. There is the famous Marxist theorist and philosophy PhD Domenico Losurdo and his work Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. There is the famous Marxist theorist Walter Rodney and his work The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World. And of course, the famous Marxist writer, theorist, and Yale political science PhD Michael Parenti and his incredible work, Black Shirts and Reds. Mind you, these are only works I mentioned that are very positive. There are plenty of more works by Robert Thurston and Stephen Wheatcroft and J. Arch Getty and others which have plenty of caveats, but which at least in part speak very positively of certain elements of the Soviet Union, or at least debunk long-held myths about the Soviet Union. On top of this are plenty of first-hand accounts of people who worked and lived in the Soviet Union during the Lenin-Stalin era, or traveled through it, that are positive accounts of the period. There's Liberty Under the Soviets by Roger Baldwin, Pat Sloan's Soviet Democracy, Black Bolshevik by the Marxist radical thinker and prominent member of the CPUSA, Harry Haywood. There is Lying Feuchtwanger's work, Moscow 1937, Anna Louise Strong's work, The Stalin Era, as well as many other works by her, The Soviet Union Through the Eyes of an American by Mike Davidow, Six Red Months in Russia by Louise Bryant, Paula Garb's They Came to Say, the famous novelist and peace activist Henry Barbusse's work, Stalin, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization by Beatrice Webb, an influential economist of the early 20th century, I Wonder as I Wander, a work by the famous poet Langston Hughes, Jessica Smith's work, Women in Soviet Russia, and Albert Rice Williams and his works on the USSR, like Through the Russian Revolution. There are more authors who don't have PhDs in Russian history, nor who actually visited the USSR in the time they wrote about it, but who are also still worth mentioning, like Ludo Martin and his work Another View of Stalin, and The Great Conspiracy Against Russia by Michael Sayers. Again, this is only works written about the pre-Khrushchev era of the USSR that are positive. I also assume there are many works out there that I simply have yet to find because of how hard it is to find many of these works in the first place, or because these works may have never been translated into English, like for example, the works of the historian Yuri Zhukov, or the book Thus Spoke Kaganovich, a published book of discussions with Lazar Kaganovich, one of Stalin's closest allies, and who remained loyal to Stalin until his death, even, like Molotov, at the cost of his own career. I scoured the internet looking for a version of this book in English, and I couldn't find it, which is pretty remarkable given that it's literally the testimony of one of Stalin's closest allies. You'd think there would be any interest in hearing what he had to say, but at most there's a few translated excerpts. I cannot find the full work. Even for the famed Domenico Losurdo, with his positive biography, there isn't an official English translation from the original Italian. I had to read a bootleg translation from the Portuguese language version. Apparently, this is because his publisher refuses to translate it to English, even though it has translated his other works to English because Losurdo speaks positively about the USSR. Mind you, I've read the book. The book was not particularly overly effusive in its praise of Stalin, from what I remember reading. It was pretty tame in my opinion, but it's still just too much for the publisher, I guess. Anyways, apparently there is another English translation coming out soon, though. This phenomenon, of course, is not unique to Losurdo's work. Many of the works mentioned here, even if in English, are out of print and almost completely unknown. Most of the rest are little read regardless of the quality of the work, because not many people are interested in hearing about the good side of the USSR or works that debunk negative myths about the USSR. None of the major anti-USSR historians are particularly known for anything beyond writing about the USSR with a couple exceptions, But the likes of Domenico Lacerdo and Walter Rodney and Michael Prenti and Beatrice Webb and Langston Hughes all were or are well known for their intellectual contributions in other regards. Paul Robeson didn't specifically write about the USSR, but he was one of the world's most famous people when he became a pro-USSR activist, and he also has been all but completely memory holed out of history. If they can't just memory hold what you've said about the USSR out of history, like with people like Einstein, they just forget you entirely, period. And then leftists will go, if the USSR wasn't terrible or whatever, where are the academics or personal accounts speaking positively about the USSR when these accounts have been censored by the West? Because why wouldn't they be? People seem to just assume that pro-USSR voices would be easy to find when the USSR was the ultimate enemy of the West for decades. Do you think that maybe the USSR wasn't the only country that ever did censorship? Do you think that maybe the West would, censor these voices? Of course, not all the authors I mentioned are, wholly positive about the Soviet Union across all of their works. Some of these works are also maybe fairly anecdotal or made of not always exceptional research. Martin's work has even been criticized by historians like Furr, for example, and the works of Carr and Sayers have received what seems like good faith criticism as well. But I think the authors that are a bit less evidence-based in their analysis at times can be somewhat forgiven for just doing the same thing that countless anti-USSR historians have done and gotten away with for decades, getting comfy tenureships and awards for scholarship that would be laughed out of a room in most historical professions. I will expand more on why and how pro-USSR works are censored and how anti-USSR works are amplified in the media, but that, of course, is for when the full video is released. In the meantime, though, thanks for watching. Thank you to my patrons, and especially my $8 patron, Alexander Bernstein, as well as to my $4 patrons, Citizen Smith, Comrade Gassy, Pivot 5000, Professional Tanky, Richard Scott Wigton, and Shivaru, and also my $1 patrons, Dust Ballet, Matthew Foy, and Southpaw 99. Thank you also to my YouTube members, YoohooTube, Sparkle Squish, and Kawa DW. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.